So, excuse me, everyone. Good morning. We'll be beginning already with our presentation for today. So, welcome to our eighth synchronous learning session. For today, we'll be discussing about clothing. For this lesson in particular, it's very much similar to hair, wherein there's no actual specific way on how you can do it, unlike, let's say, the human body, wherein you can have different ways on how to draw the human body, but at least you have sort of a standard. Whereas for clothing, you don't necessarily have that standard. So for today, we'll be talking about more of, let's say, the factors of clothing, creases and folds, and sample clothing. So these are more or less guidelines on how you can essentially do different aspects when you're doing clothing. So first of all is we have four factors in clothing. What are the things that you have to look after when you're looking into creating your clothing? So for this one, it's somewhat more specific, but there are some things that you can kind of remove, like let's say fit and material are somewhat secondary. Your primary ones are joints and tension, but it's some things that are good to know. We also have, of course, external forces, like let's say addition of water, stains, rain, wind, and so on and so forth. But we'll just be focusing on these four. So the very first one is your joints. So for your joints, the essentially what we really need to look into is more of, aside of course the construction of clothing, it's more of how the clothing reacts to the body. And usually the clothing would react in terms of the joints, and it would come into contact based on, let's say, how it would fold, how it would crease. So a lot of, let's say, the creasing or the folding really comes into, let's say, the joint. So we have here a list of joints. So of course you have your neck, rotator cuffs, elbows, wrists, the waist, pelvis, knees, and ankles. So to kind of give you an idea, let's look into these two case studies. So it's just a way for us to be able to see, um, or for me to be able to showcase that you will actually see that a lot of, let's say, the folds would come from these different joints. So we have one right here, which is a side kick. So when you're going to look into it, like let's say the neck, there's not really a lot of clothing towards the neck, so that can be removed. Rotator cuff is essentially this one right here, where your shoulders are or where your arms begin. So with this one, you would see a lot of scrunching, particularly towards the armpit. And then we also, that kind of continues on up until your elbows, and then a little bit on the wrists, but not really quite a lot. We also have a lot of bunching up of clothing when it comes to the waist. So the waist technically is a joint. So anything that you can kind of move much more freely is more or less a joint, and that is through, of course, your spinal cord, which is through your waist. So your waist, you can see right here, there's a lot of clothing. And then for the legs, you have, of course, your pelvis. So your pelvic, your hip bone, this is where kind of your legs begin. So you can see a lot of bunching up in here. So you can see a lot of folding, and then of course you have your knees, and then very particular, you can see it right here on the ankles as well. We have a second one as well. So for this one, it's a little bit more stationary of a pose, but it's still somewhat dynamic. So you can see, of course, a lot of scrunching. You can see it towards the neck. So the way that clothing behaves towards, let's say, the neck, particularly the neckline right here, you can see a lot of folding. And then, of course, you have your arms, the different parts of your arms. You can also see it towards the waistline. So particularly this part right here, wherein you have it towards around the waist. So even with the interaction of the belt. And then, of course, we have our elbows, and then you don't really have any clothing on the ankles, so there's that. So that essentially is just some things that you can look into. So if ever you're going to add folding or detailing, you might as well place it towards the joints. Next one naman is the fit. So fit mostly focuses more on how, of course, the clothing, the size of the clothing, and then how it reacts to your body. So we have three categories right here. We have fit, we have skin tight, and then we have loose. So to kind of give you an idea, fit clothing tend to have lesser folds, and then the others, like let's say skin tight and loose clothing, tend to have more folds. But then again, this is also reactive in terms of, like let's say, the material that you'll be using. Pero for now, let's just look at the fit itself. So let's have first your somewhat fit clothing. And this is symbolized by yung shirt natin dito and even your coat. So for this one and even like the top part of the second model right here. So it's kind of loose, but you can see that it kind of fits well in terms of the general shape. The loosening of, let's say, the fabric is where you want it to be loose. Essentially, you don't really see a lot of bunching up, folding up, and so on and so forth. But if it's too loose, like for example, we have the skirt right here, it really morphs into the shape of the leg right here. So you can see a lot of folding right around towards the crotch area and then towards the knees and even towards your joints right here. Comparing it to, like, let's say the blazer that we have right here, wherein it's kind of more of a fit. So you don't really see a lot of bunching up. So that's one. For the skin tight naman natin, you can very much see it again towards the thighs right here. You can see um a lot of folds, a lot of creases right around here. And if it's too loose around here on the bottom of the jeans, since it's a bell bottom, you can see that there is a lot of, or there is like a very huge fold. But once it fits around the top area, you can see that it's quite fit. So that is one thing that we look into, which is the fit. Next one naman is we have the material. So the material focuses more on what type of fabric you're using. So ito, if I were to say if there's anything that you can kind of remove or ignore, you can use, this is basically your last thing that you have to consider. For a lot of us kasi as, let's say, designers or animators, we don't even really think about the material, but in some cases, this is also like an important part. So for example, the normal things that we wear in our everyday lives or even in our casual lives. So cotton, nylon, polyester, they tend to be lesser in terms of the folds and creases that they create overall, regardless if you have them on your full or on your joints or even like let's say the fit of it, you can still have lesser creases on it compared to like let's say other types of material. So you can see that very much on the um yeah, you can see that very much on around the top right here and of course the dress. Even for right here, you can see that it's very much breathable, but it's not too you can see very, you can still kind of see the outline of the thighs because of the fit of it. Yet at the same time, if you were to compare this on the previous slide wherein we saw the dress, you can see that since this is a much looser material, you can see that it's very much tracing it, whereas for this one, it's not really that much. Next one naman is for softer materials, like let's say silk and chiffon. They tend to create a lot of creases. So for this one, particularly for like softer material, they really tend to they try to mold itself with the body regardless of the fit. So you can see right here we have very loose clothing, and that loose clothing really tries to stick into the skin because of let's say movement and other external elements. And then for thicker materials like let's say denim, wool, leather, technically speaking, they create lesser folds. So like for example, you can very much see that right here on the denim, particularly on the thighs. So let's try to look more into that one. So if you're going to look at the thighs, there's not really a lot of bunching up, and even for the leather right here. So around where the chest is, there's not really a lot of bunching up. But if there is any type of fold, it's very noticeable. So you can very much see that, let's say, on your knees. So probably you've seen it on your jeans, wherein if you're going to wear particularly skinny jeans, you would see that there's a lot of bunching up folding, even if you have taken your jeans off. And then for like thicker materials, like we have right here on the first photo, which is the snake boot, which is leather, you can very much see the folds from the reflection. And for this one, which is kind of a wool tartan material, you can see that if it does move, you can very much see how the line looks, comparing it to, like, let's say, more of a looser material. So tendency is that for thicker materials, they don't really move that much, but if they do move, you really see it. So those are, and then the last factor pa pala, tension. So tension is going to be another part when it comes to our folds and creases, where essentially tension is where you tend to see a lot of, like, let's say, it's placed on one point, or a lot of force or a lot of pressure is placed on one point. And if that point or if that part of the clothing has tension, then it can create more creases. More specifically, it is the source of almost all of the creases. So one of the best examples that we have right here is yung cape natin. So for the cape, you can see that the point of tension is on the shoulders. So sa may shoulders natin, you can see a lot of, like, let's say, a lot of folds and a lot of creases, and then that really continues down up until right here. So especially if you have a very thin point of tension, you can see that there is a lot more curve, or a lot more folds and a lot more creases. For example, we have right here. So as we've stated before, yung male shoulders natin, since this is a male model, it tends to be wider yung shoulders natin, and then for your female right here, you can see the waist. So of course, this also entails more of yung material na ginagamit natin, but you can very much see a lot of, like, lines, curves, and even tension right around here, just from the waist, because the waist creates a lot of points in tension, and then of course you have your capes right around here. So those are just some things that you can look into when you're creating your clothing. So it's better for us to be able to understand your character, as well as the clothing that you will be utilizing, before we actually look into creating the clothing itself. And the foundation of our clothing really comes from the creases and the folds. So your creases and folds natin, there is somewhat a distinction, pero generally, if we need to kind of generalize a statement, we would just utilize the term folds. Pero for this one, let's first define what they are. This is not really official. There's not really a official scientific evidence what constitutes a crease and a fold, since fashion design is somewhat more of a new scientific research. But essentially, this is how we'll be defining it in this lesson. So crease is essentially the indentation in the clothing. So indentation in the clothing, usually they are either an extension of the fold, o kaya naman it's, as stated kanina, an indentation within the space of the clothing. So anything in red that you can see right here, that is an example of a crease. Yung fold naman natin, this is defined as the scrunching of the clothing due to movement. So the fold is essentially an evidence in tension. So if there is tension, usually that is exhibited by the fold. So anything that's green right here, that is an example of a fold. And you can very much see, like in this example, from a fold, meron tayong nakikitang green dito, it suddenly turns to red, because as stated kanina, usually a crease would extend a fold to make it much more apparent, or depending on, let's say, yung material as well as the fit of the clothing. So you can use it in a number of ways. There's not really a specific way on how you can utilize yung creases and folds natin. It really depends, of course, on our factors. But if in case you want to add a crease or a fold, you have to take into consideration two main actions. That is pinch and drag. So pinch is essentially the main tension point. So you always start off with your main tension point. Whereas for drag naman, it is usually a secondary thing that you have to think about, because those are caused by the pinch. So for you to be able to create your fold, you have to determine a pinch point first. So usually, yung pinch natin comes from tension. And tension usually comes from joints. So you would see a lot of tension towards the joints right here. So yung pinch natin in this example, the one in red, is near towards your elbow, because that is a joint. And even right here, it's near towards the wrist. So you can see some sort of pinch nearer towards our joints. And then for you to be able to constitute o kaya naman for you to be able to add more details towards your tension points, you'll have to add drag. So the folds and creases that are caused by your pinch. So we have here some steps in drawing folds and creases. So let me just state it one by one for me to be able to, and then I'll try to demonstrate it to you. So the first one is for you to determine your pinch point. So you have to determine where your joints are, and then determine the point of tension, and then afterwards you can go to the second part, which is drawing triangular like shapes for the top for the folds. And then extend the folds with creases, and then the last one is to draw fewer creases to add a lot more detail. So let's try that right here. So I've actually prepared kind of like a model study. So let's try to do one for this arm right here. Okay, so yeah, to kind of give you an idea, we have kind of like this half body model. So what we'll be focusing on is the sleeve right here, because it can create a lot of really good tension points. So the first one is, let me just change yung kulay natin dito so that you can see somewhat of the difference. So with this one, the first thing that we'll have to determine are, of course, your pinch points. So for you to be able to determine that, you'll have to find your joints. So your joints are this one right here, your rotator cuff. We have this point right here, which is our elbow. And then we have this one right here, which is our wrist. So anything wherein you see a lot of bunching, that is usually where your tension point is. So we have one around here. Okay, let's just turn it into red para mas makita siya. You have one here. You have another one here. And then you have another one right here. So you would tend to create a lot more folds based on this one. Okay, next one is we will now be creating yung triangular points natin for the top of the folds. So let's start off with this one first. So what we would usually do is to create kind of like triangular shapes. So itong mga triangular shapes na to, they would kind of represent yung folding natin. So when you're creating this one, it really depends again on, of course, the fit of your material and so on and so forth. So usually around these points, kailangan medyo marami tayong folds. And the folds right here tend to be thinner or taller. So you can see na yung triangles na ginagawa ko dito, they tend to be taller. And then once we move on towards, like, let's say, the lower areas, you tend to see that the creation of the triangles tend to be less steep, and at the same time, they tend to grow longer. So like, let's say for this one, mas mataas ito compared to this one right there. And then another thing when it comes to looking into your folds is for you to also look into the opposite side. So when you're looking at the opposite side, depending if there is a lot of tension, so for example dito, maglalagay din tayo ng mga triangular lines right around here. So damihan pa natin ng konti. So much more than these ones. So itong part na to, probably we would like to make it a little bit more loose kasi yun nga, around this area, it becomes tighter and then it becomes thinner and thinner here. So you have to make the triangle somewhat less steep and much longer. Yet at the same time, you also have to take into consideration yung distance din natin. So there. Not a lot. And then last one, dito we might need, of course, a lot of tension points right around here. So there. Then the last next step is for us to be able to extend these lines. So essentially, you have your triangle shapes like these. Ang gagawin nyo lang is extend nyo lang ng pababa. So for these ones, the lesser tension, of course, the lesser creases. So ito wala masyadong tension, so we'll still extend pero not a lot. Dito naman sa may part natin towards your armpit, dito natin dadamihan. So for the creation of your creases, it would be much better if, again, you start from the base of the triangle. You can add a lot more if you would need to. So, something like this. Dagdagan pa natin dito. Again, pwede nating gawing dalawa. Dito, again, you might want to add a lot more. Around this area. Dito, not so much. And then, the last part is we can add few creases surrounding the main folds. So again, this would depend on the intensity of the fold. So around dito, magdadagdag pa tayo ng mas maraming folds. You can create connecting lines. So reminder ulit, don't try to add to, or whenever you're creating lines, try to make it a little bit broken so that they would look much more natural. Then you can probably add like one right here. You can add like these small C shapes and then small V shapes around it. Then for this one, for the sake of this one, i-connect ko muna sila. So yeah, that's essentially how you would create somewhat of a fold. So kind of looks like this. I've removed this one kasi you need, of course, the arm right here. So that's just a basic way on how you can create your folds. Might I suggest na later on you would not use as many lines as I have used right here. Dapat mas konti sila. Only if, let's say, you're going to utilize a very thin type of clothing. Like, let's say, probably if the sleeve right here was made out of silk or organza, probably we can have as many lines as this. But just having a cloth, and even like, let's say, wool or denim type of jacket, you won't really necessitate to have this much detail. So, medyo in-exaggerate ko lang for demonstration purposes. And with that, let's go back to, sorry, there we go. So, there. Last part naman natin is the sample clothing. So for your sample clothing, in this part, babalik ulit tayo later on for the demonstration. Pero for now, what we will be doing is that I'll be focusing first more on the tips for you to be able to draw clothing. So number one is for you to understand, of course, the factors of the clothing that you will need to create. So understand what fit, what material you'll be using, know where the tension points are, and for you to be able to know the tension points, you'll have to know where the joints are. Next one is to take note of the action of the character. So for the action of the character, this is an additional one, particularly if, like, let's say you want to add more tension points. So for example, if a person is sitting on a chair, the tension point won't just come from the joints, but it should also come from the chair. O kaya naman if you have wind, that will again determine the direction of the clothing that you will be having. You would also need to take into consideration, of course, gravity. So like, let's say if your arm is placed downwards, then yung direction ng folds natin would also go downwards. Next one is not to overdraw too much yung mga folds and creases natin. As I've stated a while ago, the one that I have showcased kanina is more or less an exaggeration. And always use references. So similar to hair, whenever you're creating clothing, you don't really want to create out of imagination. Even like, let's say, your own clothing right now, you can utilize that as reference, particularly yung mga folds natin in the sleeves and so on and so forth. And it's really better for you to have references. Even like, let's say, yung mga talagang veterano na when it comes to drawing, there are some instances, of course, that they will be using references, particularly for more intensive action, o kaya naman when it comes to characters that, let's say, they have more intense actions o kaya naman they're not really familiar with how this material would work or how this certain fit would kind of work. So those are just some things that you need to take into consideration. So with that one, I'll be closing yung PowerPoint natin and we will now be going into the actual demonstration. Okay, let me just close my PowerPoint right here. And there you go. So, first thing that I will have to showcase muna is yung sleeves natin. Kasi yung sa may sleeves, you'll have to look into two parts. So, of course, yung holes natin. And then the second part is yung folds and whatnot. So, we had a little bit on the folds a while ago. Pero for now, let's try to focus on creating holes. So, ang common mistake kasi natin is that when you're creating holes, ang ginagawa natin is that you're just creating a straight line like this, which is incorrect. So, dapat ang ginagawa natin is that you're kind of thinking of it as adding an oval. So, yung oval na yon, regardless if you have a fit or a loose type of thing, you should be able to recreate some sort of an oval. Because again, if you remember, yung wrist natin, or even like, let's say, your neck, wherever your hole's gonna go, your waistline, all of those ones are cylindrical somewhat in nature. So, it's quite important for us to think that way. So, you can have something like that. So, kung gusto mong fit, pwedeng ganyan. Kung medyo loose, of course, you can add more. Another thing pala is that when you're creating yung hole natin, regardless if you're going to create a skin tight talaga o kaya naman a very loose one, it should still be a bit wider compared to the actual wrist. So like let's say if you want something that's a little bit more skin tight, you can have something like this, pero there should still be some sort of outside clothing because of course your clothing technically has volume. So for you to be able to do that, again, gagawa ka ng parang semicircle dito. Or sorry, ng oval dito. Ito, this is more of a fit one, so there's a little bit of space. So you have that one. So essentially, you're just creating a really thin oval. And then, you kind of trace that. Add a little bit more dimension right here. Para lang may guideline tayo. And then, next is that you're going to, from the sides of the oval, maglalagay ulit tayo ng line dito. And then, you will be tracing essentially this oval thing right here. Parang ganyan. Next part is, I'll just be erasing these parts kasi most of these ones are essentially just guidelines. So there, you have something like that. This is also applicable to your neckline. So for your neckline, of course, you still need a little bit of this space. So regardless if you have like a V-neck o kaya naman a normal crew neck, siguro yung pinagkaiba lang is if you have a collar. So let's try to do the collar on the neck right here. So I'll just be showcasing you how we're going to do different parts of the collar through this model right here. So, pag crew neck yung gagamitin natin, so again, you'll be creating sort of this C. You extend that C a little bit, then you kind of taper it off. So, medyo i-close nyo siya ng konti, pag ganyan. Then, again, add a little bit of volume by tracing it. Then, pwede ka maglagay ng like line like this. Pero again, I much prefer to make it broken so that it's not entirely complete. So you can do something like that. Pwede rin naman. So just erase this one. For V-neck, it would be somewhat the same thing. So for your V-neck, maglagay ka lang ng parang tape. You're just creating like a very small triangle, so to speak. And then tracing that one around here towards the sides. Please notice as well that I am simply tracing the shoulders right here. So I'm not like creating it much lower. I can somewhat make it a bit bigger by making it like this. That's acceptable, but it should not really go past yung shoulders natin. That's why we have added this sort of volume. And then from that, you can then add this one. Yung color naman natin, for your color, there are a lot of different types of creating yung colors natin. Pero like, let's say, let me showcase one type. So one type, you would use this one as somewhat of a foundation. And then, ang gagawin mo is that at the base of your V right here, you might want to create the V a bit smaller. Pero I'll just be utilizing this. Ang gagawin mo dito is that you'll be creating kind of like, I'm not so sure how to describe this, pero the best way that I can do it is that, remember yung mga ginagawa yung ibon when you were like children, you're like just creating this type of shape. That's also kind of like the same type of shape that you're going to create. And then, again, from your neck, you'll be creating this line again to kind of add volume. Then extend it a little bit. Then you can do something like this. So for this one, please take note na yung thickness ng nandito natin sa may base natin or sa may end ng collar natin up until right here sa may neck natin. It should be much thicker around this area compared to this one right here. Then for another type of collar that you might want to create. So for this one, I'll be going a bit higher actually. So for this, medyo itataas natin ng konti. Technically, I'll still be creating that V. Pero, again, I'll be creating it a bit higher. Number 2, at the end, I'm going to not connect it yet. For me to be able to connect it, I'll be creating this same shape. Yung parang bird, elementary bird type of shape. But it should be longer and thinner. So it's almost like an elongated V shape. And then, create curved lines. So yung curved lines natin, it's like you're creating an M shape. Pero number 1, dapat itong mga parts na to, they should not touch. So you're not really connecting these lines. Nope, you're not doing that one. And then, of course, they should be wider right around here. And then again, doing the same thing. So with that one, this is a much higher color. If like let's say you might want to create a bow tie right here o kaya naman a necktie, it's possible for you to utilize this one. So those are just some ways on how you can create colors on shirts. Next one naman is probably we can showcase how you can create a scarf. So yung sa may scarf natin, it's a little bit complicated. Kasi yung scarf natin, for a lot of the times, it's created by a thin wool, o kaya naman organza, o kaya naman it's knitted, o kaya naman it's silk. So, regardless of how you're going to look at it, it tends to be a lot thinner. So, with that one, you'll have to create a lot of folds. And when you're creating a lot of folds, there might be some sort of confusion, particularly with wrapping your scarf around the neck. So, might I suggest yung atake natin dito is that you have to start creating basic shapes first. And then from that basic shape, doon ka maglagay ng, like, let's say, iba pang details. So, for this one, I'll be creating another layer. Then, I'll be utilizing another color right here. So, the first thing that I might want to create is, again, yung basic shape. So, for your scarves kasi marami tayong different types. So, of course, you have let's say, yung talagang nakarap lang sa main neck natin na ganyan. Then you can have like here, that's possible. You also have another type of, let's say, scarf wherein it's kind of like a V shape, kind of like this one. Then it wraps around your neck. So you can do something like that. Kaya naman, it's somewhat a variation of what I did a while ago. So it's going to be wrapping around the neck. It's much larger. Pero for this one, we'll be dividing it into parts. So that it kind of has that more dramatic, bigger scarf effect. So based from that one, add your basic shapes. And then, from the basic shape, medyo bawasan ko lang yung opacity ng konti. Now, I'm going to add yung actual details. So, for the actual details naman, what I will be doing is, yung atake ko rin dito sa may sleeves niya. So, first of all is for me to be able to create yung mga folds. So, for the folds, I'll be creating these triangle shapes. So, when you're creating these triangle shapes, might I suggest don't think about it too much. There is a need for you to have variety and unpredictability. And if you're thinking too much, tendency is that you're creating the same sizes. So, just letting yourself create like these uneven rounded triangle shapes would really help. From that point, hatiin natin or sorry, we can add yung mga lines natin dito. So, when you're creating these crease lines, it's important for you to be able to determine kung saan yung direction niya. So, like let's say there are some instances kasi around this part, you would see of course a curve. So, maglalagay tayo ng konting curve dito. Whereas for dito, talagang straight on ahead siya. So, you'll be creating somewhat of a straight on ahead. Then when you're creating creases, don't think too much about it. You can randomly add like double lines within one base of a crease. You can also add like let's say continuation. So parang may pa-V na ganyan. Then like let's say dito, pwede tayo maglagay dito since there's a little bit of tension. And then complete the rest of the scarf. So for this one, yung scarf natin still kind of wraps around the body, or around the neck. So it would still have that same treatment as how you would kind of wrap or how you would draw like let's say the opening of your shirt, yung parang crew neck natin or your V-neck. Then for this one, I'll try a little bit of variety, making it so yeah. As you can see, I'm also adding like more creases along the way as I'm adding the outline. You can do something like that one as well. Then add additional creases right around here. Since this is a scarf, it needs somewhat a lot of detailing. But then again, there is something as overdrawing right here. Another thing pala when it comes to tension. So when it comes to tension pala, aside from the folds that you're creating right here, it should somewhat also reflect down here. So sabihin natin, nag-fold siya dito. Dapat magfo-fold din siya dito. Then, pwedeng paganyan. So, meron kasi yung iba ang ginagawa nila is that, like, yeah, they have this one, tapos nakakonect siyang paganyan, pero this one is just straight. So, it doesn't look natural. Try to taper it off as well, particularly if you have, like, this type of one-point tension. So, for you to kind of understand it better, references really will help you. So, you can add, like, these other details sa may scarf natin. So there. That's how you can create a scarf. To better differentiate it, let me just shade this part out. So this is like your black hole your black or like black space. So core shadow rather. So can do something like that. Okay. So with that part, probably we can move around in here. So since wala tayong masyadong time, I'll try to just focus on the important parts. So for the male, I'll be doing a bottom, and then for the female, I'll try to focus on, like, let's say, um yung common mistake natin when it comes to creating shirts for women and external tension, the one that I've been stating, particularly when it comes to dresses or on when it comes to skirts. So for your male right here, I'll be using green naman. So for this one, of course, you need yung band natin dito. So it's important for you to be able to determine yung, again, waist. So the creation of this one is the same as this one right here, yung sa may kamay natin. So the thing about clothes is that it's part of the rendering process. So you can, of course, add the renders right away. So for this part, we will have to determine kung nasan yung parts ng tension natin. So for the tension, there's really a lot, not necessarily on the crotch, pero yung tension that may come from the crotch is transferred around this area right here, wherein you kind of have yung zipper. And then we also have a lot of tension around the sides of the hips. So number one is primarily it's for the pockets. And then number two is that there's a lot of movement that goes around here. So of course, maraming lines dito. So you might want to create very small lang. It doesn't really have to be a lot. Like let's say right now I've created two around here. Dito since medyo 3/4 tayo, I can just simply trace right here for the buttocks and then add a curve here. And then yung sa may dito natin sa may knees. So for the knees, what I would tend to create is like you would create this really big fold right here. And then dito sa may likod, you would create the very small triangular ones. So meron tayong folds na pababa, meron din tayong folds na pataas. And then a little bit towards here. So again, parang gumagawa ka lang ng maliit na parang zigzag lines lang around here and around here. Since there's a lot of motion right there. Again, dito. Like just this really huge triangle. Smaller triangles at the back. Then from that point on, pwede ka na mag-connect. So you can start connecting these parts. Sabihin natin if this is like a straight fit type of bottom, then you can just simply trace these parts. Then it becomes thinner and thinner as you move towards. Or there's a lot more space rather going towards this part. So as you can see, I'm not really adding a lot of folds towards the non-joint parts. So that's really something that you can do. But at the same time, clothing is something that is moving. So common mistake din ng students that I tend to see a lot is that talagang straight line lang siya. So it almost looks like you've placed it on a flat lay surface, and you don't really want that. You still want to make it so that your clothing is moving together with the body. So whenever you're creating them, try to utilize as much curved lines as possible. Like as you can see, I do have some straight lines, pero yung pagka-straight niya is that it's not like it was created with a ruler. So you need to be able to create that sort of it should look very natural. So there's a lot of full when it comes to denim. So usually I think a lot of us pag lumalabas tayo, we tend to use denim. There's really a lot of like there's a lot of folds around this area, particularly the back of the knees. You don't really see it on the front of the knees, but on the back knees, you can see it quite a lot. And then dito sa may sides natin, you don't really see it. So as you can see, it's very thin. Then if I were to create creases, I can create creases right around here. Again, not too much. We don't really want to over add too much detail on this one. Okay, let's say I think we're good with this one. Siguro what I would just like to do is to add some sort of color so that you can see the difference. Okay. Hindi siya masyadong kita, pero as you can see some sort of bunching towards the ends right here or towards the joints. Of course, you have your lines there. So that's essentially how you would create bottoms. Sa may tops kasi natin, you don't really need to think too much about it. The only thing that you have a lot of joints are is, again, on the joints. And then everything else, you're just simply going to trace it, albeit there's a little bit more space. Okay, now let's move on to, let's say, yung sa may female natin. So I have here kind of like a sitting female. For this one, I would like to showcase some of the points that a lot of people tend to forget when they're trying to add clothes for the female body. So the first one is really towards the top. So I'll just be creating a normal top right here, normal t-shirt, whichever. So when you're creating, of course, clothing for your female, one of the more common or one of the, let's say, main things that you have to take into consideration is, of course, yung sa may breasts natin. So, ang common mistake kasi, even in like, let's say, Japanese animation, what they would do is that they would trace kung ano yung space ng kung ano yung outline ng breasts natin, they kind of just take an outline, something like that, which is incorrect. Kasi yung clothing natin, of course, it doesn't really morph. It's not like clay. So with this one, once you reach, like, let's say, yung breasts natin dito, what should happen is more of this. So there should be a little bit of space from the waistline based on, again, let's say, the widest, o kaya naman, the widest point of yung sa may breasts natin. Then the way that you would create normally yung t-shirt natin, you just simply have to trace, really. Don't really think too much about it. And then yung sa may skirts. So yung sa may skirts natin, there are a lot of different types of how you can create skirts. So if you're going to look at different references, of course, you have first of all yung pencil skirt natin, which essentially just traces yung body. And then we also have kind of like yung pleated skirt. So for the pleated skirt, you need to be able to create a band. And then from the band, you can then create different lines. So just create multiple lines. Then from those lines, you just have to connect them by adding these curved lines. So you can create something like that. O kaya naman a more complicated pleat, still follow the same guideline. Then start from here. Sa may center natin. Then something like that. O kaya naman you can also create a gather. So if you're trying to look at the pattern here, when you're creating a skirt, more or less, it's better for you to kind of have a band on. Then from that one, you can create like a lot of lines around here. So again, make it really different, and then based from that, you can add a lot more flow. So parang yung mga skater skirts natin, something like that. One thing when it comes to, again, yung skirts natin, is you have to take into account a lot of external factors. So for example, you have this character here, which is sitting down. So when your character is sitting down, it still has to follow somewhat more of the guideline, or it still has to follow the pose that you're utilizing. So if ever, let's say, gagawa kayo ng pleated skirt, of course, you need to have your waist right here. It shouldn't really just go down na pababang paganon. Of course, it should somewhat trace yung movement nung character natin. So around this area, should follow this point right here. Pero at the same time, it shouldn't really go na lahat pa ganyan. That's not really the point. Ang ginagawa natin dito is that slowly, bumababa siya, pa ganyan, then of course, it kind of course, since it's a skirt, you're kind of sitting on it. So that's just one thing that you have to take into consideration when you have these sort of external factors. So yung movement ng skirt natin is essentially following, again, yung movement ng character. Then you can add, you don't really need to add like, you can add some sort of creasing right here, but that's not really necessary. So those are just some things that you have to take into consideration when you are drawing clothing. So as I've stated kanina before we end this lesson, is that when you're creating clothing, it's really a case-to-case basis. I can't really teach you every single thing that there is when it comes to clothing. So how, like, let's say we have different types of styles, we have different types of clothing. There are a lot more things that I haven't really showcased right here, which is something that you might be looking into. And really, the best thing that I can offer to you as advice is to look into references, see how they've created it, utilize natin yung mga factors natin for us to be able to integrate it to our characters. So with that one, that ends our synchronous learning session for today. If you have any questions, please let me know na lang. Through email na lang, please, because I can't really utilize my messenger as of now. So with that, I'll see you next week. Bye everyone.